Many years ago, I had a university professor, history professor, who asked the question, why are third world countries so poor while other countries are so rich? I thought the answer was easy. At least the answer seemed easy to me because I have an economics background. I responded that wealthier nations had the consistent rule of law instead of the arbitrary and capricious law of rulers. And I went on to say in the class that those countries who espoused a moral standard, and when that moral standard was codified or written down in secular law, then those countries were more productive. I was thinking in my own mind that the Ten Commandments, whose principles were mostly adopted by the Western countries. However, it wouldn't be politically correct or even wise to say the Ten Commandments or mention them in a classroom with an atheist professor, so I used the term moral standards instead. The professor seemed shocked at my answer and said, "No, poor nations are poor because of imperialism, that the poor nations have been exploited by the rich nations. It's colonialism that's caused such a great divide." Well, granted, it's certainly true that colonial empires were built by some countries setting up colonies and then extracting resources from those colonies. But such an economic term, that the economic system you're using is termed mercantilism, and it was designed to benefit one mother country at the expense of the colonies. But I found it was interesting that the professor was so bound up in her ideology of the rich oppressing the poor that she couldn't even conceive of the notion in which societies internally and consistently practiced a consistent moral standard. And this professor simply dismissed the idea that a consistent moral standard was essential for prosperity. My history professor couldn't see her argument about the rich and the poor was really a tacit acceptance of the admonitions found in the Ten Commandments of the Bible. In particular, don't steal, don't lie, and don't covet. While she did not accept that a moral standard about that was essential to national prosperity, she couldn't explain how to define right and wrong absent a moral standard. Of course, we know where moral standards come from, and those standards have consistently been recorded and then reinforced in the biblical record for thousands of years. Well, the title of today's message is Blessings from the Rule of Law. Blessings from the Rule of Law. Well, first of all, because I was a Protestant prior to coming into God's church, whenever I heard the word blessings, I kind of cringed. I tended to associate the term with some syrupy good feeling rather than positive, measurable results. But once I understood the term blessing to be a gift from someone or the result of positive action, then I became more comfortable with the term blessings. I'd like to turn to Psalm 1. So turning to Psalm 1, and I'm going to read it in the New International Version. I compared several translations. This has a good flow to it. In Psalm 1, starting in verse 1, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked or stand in the way that sinners take or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of God and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf doesn't wither. Whatever they do prospers." Well, this psalm or song in the Bible warns everyone to avoid doing the bad things and advises us to do good things instead. Wow, what a remarkable concept. But unless there's a concrete moral standard of what's right and wrong, how can anyone determine whether they are in fact doing what's right or are they doing what's wrong? And of course, we're fortunate. We have that Bible that has long been proven to be consistent and reliable standard for measuring right and wrong. Unfortunately, throughout time, many empires of the world didn't adhere to biblical standards of right and wrong. We can just go through the list of major empires in ancient world history: Sumeria, Babylonia, Assyria, the Hittite, the Chaldean, the Egyptian, the Medes, the Persians, the Macedonians or Greeks, the Inca, and the Aztec in the New World, and most famously, of course, the Roman Empire. They all violated biblical standards of right and wrong. The empires came and they went. How did these people and their ancient empires obtain wealth? And sadly, the answer is this: they obtained wealth by forcibly taking wealth that was earned by other people. Yet, for all of the development of all of these world empires and their great reputations of expansion, the lifestyles and living conditions of people didn't improve markedly. In his book, The 5,000-Year Leap, author W. Cleon Skousen notes that from antiquity to about 1750 A.D., near the beginning of America, the living standards of people approximately doubled over the previous 5,000 years, or 6,000 years. But since the year 1750 and the founding of America, the living standards, particularly in America, have skyrocketed. Well, economists have then graphed the rise in living standards that accompanies a marked increase in what they measure as gross domestic product. Well, that's economics talk for how much is produced in a country of all goods and services. And economists use gross domestic product, or GDP, to measure and compare wealth from one country to another. What was different about prior to the ages of before 1750 and then the modern age since 1750? Why has there been a dramatic increase in the inventions and productivity since the founding of America? Author Skousen goes on to postulate that America has become the wealthiest nation on earth by serving the needs of people instead of just taking wealth from others, the others who earned it. Imagine that. An economic system that serves the wants and needs of others in exchange for an agreeable compensation that allows both parties to prosper. Well, where did this idea come from? That people could prosper by serving the needs and desires of other people. Let's turn to Philippians in chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2, it's a short verse, Philippians 2, verse 4. I'm going to read this in English Standard Version. Let not each of you look not only to his own interests. Well, let's stop right there. There's a comma in my version, but let's stop at that for the moment and say, in other words, we are to look after our own interests, do what's good for ourselves, be responsible in our own lives. But it says, don't stop there. Don't look just after your own interests, but to the interests of others. It's really quite interesting that when we look to our own interests to produce and sell goods and services to others that have needs and wants, then both parties benefit. And this production and the subsequent market transactions occur under the consistent rule of law in a Western world, in the Western countries, and especially in America. And in fact, then the government protects this exchange of property through the consistent rule of law. Each summer for the past couple of years, I've taken a grad school course in economics. Last summer, I was at Rice University in Houston, Texas. There were 3 economics professors, and they were presenting the course, and never once did they mention the Bible. Never once did they mention the 10 Commandments. Not once did they mention the word blessings. They displayed the research that shows how poor nations differ from rich nations. This research led to the inescapable conclusion that 3 legal and moral principles just happened to be espoused in the Bible were absolutely essential for the creation and accumulation of wealth. The ordinary person in each nation that practiced these 3 principles were better off. They had significantly improved lifestyles as compared to the nations who didn't practice the principles. And of course, the economists measure lifestyles such as the number of households with things like running water, flush toilets, 24/7 electrical service, infant mortality, longevity, crime, and so forth. Well, the 3 principles included, surprise, surprise, the consistent rule of law. Research demonstrates that even if countries didn't do a very good job of living up to the official stated moral standard, those countries did better than the countries that did not have a positive moral standard. We can look around the world and study the poorest nations. Many poor nations are rich in natural resources, but corruption is rampant. Their governments turn a blind eye to law enforcement. Yet there are some small countries that have few or no natural resources that are remarkably wealthy. Just look at Israel. No particular natural resources to speak of, or perhaps Hong Kong, one of the wealthiest states in the world, and without natural resources. Yet both of those nations inherited the British system of the rule of law, and their standards of living are well above the rest of the world. Well, today I just want to focus on that one principle, the consistent rule of law, And that means that even the king or the government has to follow the law. The law then is predictable, and it's equally administered to all. In ancient Israel, the king was required to write out the books of the law. There's something quite personal about sitting down for many hours, days, and weeks, personally writing out the books of the law. And when we write things down, we tend to do a better job of remembering them. I know we do that in my classroom, is by the end of the year, the students have written down every person that's in the textbook in American history, every key term and event, and have established essentially their own textbook in their own handwriting by the end of the year. We do it a little bit every day. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17 is starting in verse 18. Talking about the requirements for a king in Israel. Deuteronomy 17, verse 18. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear God, the Lord God, by keeping all the words of this law, these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Well, this concept that the king or the government must follow its own rules for economic stability and growth was emphasized again in the secular world in the year 1215 AD. And that's when they had the establishment of a document you may have heard. In Latin, it's called the Magna Carta, Great Charter in English. And it was in England. Evil King John was forced by 25 noblemen and their armies to sign this historic document, the Magna Carta. And what did the document say? The king was required to follow the law. 474 years later, a descendant of evil King John was on the throne, King James II. In 1689, there was a revolution. The distrusted King James II was dethroned for failing to follow the law. The new king and queen, William and Mary, agreed to a restatement of the Magna Carta when they signed the English Bill of Rights. This new king and queen acknowledged in writing that the king and the queen had to follow the law. Since that time, the British peoples have subsequently grown to be among the wealthiest countries on earth. It's taken thousands of years for mankind to figure out how some of the keys to prosperity. And yet those keys to individual and national prosperity have been right there in the Bible all along. Our second hymn today, we went through on hymn 21, it was Psalm 33. And what's the title of that hymn? Was Blessed is the Nation God is For. I'd like to close with the first two verses of Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 and 2. And if we get excited, we can read the whole chapter, but I just want to look at verses 1 and 2. And I'm going to read this in the English Standard Version. And if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Well, as a country decides to follow a consistent rule of law, and to the extent that mankind's law is compatible with God's laws, a nation will prosper. But a nation is only a conglomeration of its individuals. It's up to us, individually, to decide whether to follow the principles laid out in the Bible. When we accept that there is a right and a wrong, and we choose to do the right, we will then reap the individual and national blessings.